All right, sorry for the disruption there. So, GDP is the total output of goods and services in a certain country's economy over a given period of time. And we remember the formula G plus I plus C plus imports minus exports. And Ethiopia's GDP, which also reflects the purchasing power parity, is 200.6 billion US dollars, and it has seen a remarkable, what a lot of economists and politicians say, an economic miracle, a 10.9% growth rate, which is the fifth highest in the world over these years. And to be more reflective of the monetary wealth of Ethiopia, the GDP per capita is $2,200. And the Gini index, we remember the lower the better, which shows the distribution and income equality in a country. Actually, surprisingly, Ethiopia fares better than other African countries, and it's more closer to its Scandinavian partners rather than its African counterparts here at 35%. And one thing I forgot to mention, this is a graph of Ethiopia's incredible economic development, a huge increase beginning from the early 2000s that hasn't stopped ever since. And thus appropriate to note the inflation rate, which is close to 10%, which is quite far from the target, from the government's target rate, macroeconomic objective. However, it's fairly reasonable given Ethiopia's extreme extreme economic growth over these years. So the Ethiopia has a labor force of people who are willing and actively looking for work, who are willing and able to work, of 53 million people. And the majority of this labor force is focused, as I mentioned, agrarian society. So a lot of those workers are employed in the agriculture sector with almost 73%. However, it's making and paving its way for a growing services sector with almost 20% and an industry sector of 7.4%. So the population below poverty line of Ethiopia, of people living below the poverty line, is almost 30%, which is a huge flaw in the Ethiopian economy today. However, it is regardless important to know the incredible strives of progress and achievement made over the years. So in the 90s, the statistics were different. They over 50% of Ethiopians used to live below the poverty line. So you can see why a country living through conflict has struggled. However, it's clear from government banners, from government official reports, that the main objective is to alleviate mm, the the Ethiopian nation from poverty. So, agricultural's share of GDP has shrunk by 25% from 2005 to 2018. But regardless, as we see in this graph to the right, a huge piece of the pie is still today predominantly agriculture, despite the decrease. And This made way for the service sector, which grew by 27% during the same tenure, the same period of time, and it includes sectors like communication, transportation services, hotels, restaurants, entertainment, wholesale, retail trading, and also here. Likewise, an important part of Ethiopian GDP is the industrial sector, which consists of mainly logistical aspects like the construction industry, which is responsible for the roads, railways, dams, and etc. So, on the international economic side. So Ethiopia and its government more specifically follow the export promotion strategy, an outward-oriented strategy, and as of today, it is reliant on its raw commodity market, and it's led by the service sector. And by that, um, I mean the transportation. As I've mentioned, part of transportation services is the Ethiopian Airlines carrier, which has seen rapid growth over the years and gained a huge popularity and respect, and is becoming a prestigious cargo delivery service, and it enhanced basically the trading opportunities and is a key gateway for the Ethiopian exports. So the largest commodity that Ethiopia exports is coffee, and it remains the third largest world producers of Arabica seeds today. And I was pleased to note that Ethiopia is pursuing means of export diversification, which is essential for today's developing nations as we see the inelasticity of PS and PDs of supply and demand for raw goods as more alternatives are synthetically fabricated, and because of the market's volatility. Uh, but still, Ethiopia to this day remains reliant on raw commodities, um, which the coronavirus pandemic does not make any easier, as I will elaborate on later. But it has seen diversifications, like here we see gold, sesame, cat, livestock, and horticulture, all means of diversifying Ethiopian exports. And here we see a pie chart to our right with the key partners of Ethiopia's bilateral trade. China being the first, majority of Ethiopian exports go to China, and then we have the neighbors Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Netherlands, the United States, and other countries. And the chart of coffee shows the export value of coffee, the biggest commodity of Ethiopia, and how it has grown over the period of 2011 2015 steadily. But we see here actually a discrepancy. In 2015 it's began to drop, and ever since, uh, it's the price of coffee on the world market has dropped. So despite the production increases, there's actually less revenue for Ethiopian exporters because of the depressed commodity prices. Which is why a lot of developing nations see it as a risk of over relying on raw commodities. So moving on, international economics. So manufacturing today represents only 8% of Ethiopian exports, but however, it's likely to grow in the future, which is a good sign because of the international presence in Ethiopia. For example, China has been a key investor in Ethiopian industrial capacity and infrastructure, an active participant. And some of the benefits of foreign direct investment is technological transfer, and this helps Ethiopia increase its production possibilities. So, if we were to imagine a production possibilities frontier, it would grow outwards as a consequence of technology and innovation. So the value of exported goods and services took a value of 2.83 billion in 2018, and for the last 5 years, the export revenue has decreased annually at a pretty high rate, 7.1%. And as I've mentioned, that's because of the depressed commodity prices. However, it is also because the Ethiopian government has devalued its national currency, birr, in order to increase its stock and reserves of foreign currency. So international economics, last part. So imported goods and services took a value of $8 billion in 2018, And here we see the division 34. The majority was spent on capital goods rather than consumer goods. And if we look at the chart below, we can see that majority of imports are gas, telephones, planes, helicopters. Uzbek taking incredible 8.3%. So a lot is technology, medicine, and other utilities. Um, and in regards to spacecraft, important to note it's a slight microcosm of Ethiopian economy and the presence of key international players. So I was surprised to find out that Ethiopia actually has an important presence in space, as it has recently, in 2019, has launched its satellite into the lower Earth orbit, and very few African countries. I think there are only a couple more African countries that have done so, as it's a very lucrative affair to indulge in. And so I was surprised that for a country with about 20-30% living in poverty, it can afford to invest in the space sector. Uh, and thus, I resumed to doing a bit further research down the line, and I realized that I found out actually that China is the satellite that Ethiopia launched was launched from a Chinese airspace, and China was a heavy investor in that project, budgeting about 70% of this launch and of the satellite construction was produced by a Chinese manufacturer, which Ethiopia paid 30% for. And today, Ethiopia it maintains the control of with its own headquarters in Ethiopia of the station. However, this this can also be seen as China a key strategic ploy of China to increase its space presence by utilizing and cooperating with developing nations. So indirectly, it increases its influence in sort of this new space race that has been occurring in the world. But it's also important not to disregard the positive economic impacts it had on the Ethiopian economy. First of all, it created new jobs. Secondly, um, there has been also a greater interest in Ethiopia's Space Institute. And thirdly, the satellite itself has crucial practical uses for economics, like it is able to track the impacts of climate change on Ethiopia's agriculture and weather forecasting and things as such. Um, and yes, and so moving on, the main import partners of Ethiopia uh, is mainly China. We see still the same trend here. However, it also imports from the US, Saudi Arabia, and India.